UI design principles. What makes things actually look good? Or if not good, at least not terrible. So, oh, whoops. I did not change that slide. That's fun. All right. So what did I do? I made a Figma to go over some important UI design principles. Starting off with visual hierarchy. Basically the idea that, well, there are lots of elements to visual hierarchy, but the most obvious one is something like, the bigger something is, the more dominant it will be in the frame, the more users will notice it and the more important it will seem. So, as I've said here, size is equal to importance. The smaller things are, the less important that they seem. Cool. That's visual hierarchy principle number 1. Principle number 2, use contrasting colors. So by contrasting colors, I mean colors that you can very easily tell apart. Yeah. So you will notice, I think, that this, bright yellow stands out quite a lot compared to this white text because they are sort of noticeably different, and that it draws the eye quite viscerally to this, more so than it would have been if this was just a white arrow or something like that, or like a dark sort of gray arrow that was similar in color to the background. Use colors that pop out from the colors that surround them if you want to emphasize something. So contrasting colors and contrast in general. Visual hierarchy principle number 2. Number 3, alignment. You can use alignment or non-alignment to emphasize something or highlight something. So for example, if you had a bunch of, say, boxes, and say these boxes were buttons, and you wanted to highlight which button was currently being hovered on, you could, there are a few different approaches to doing that. One would obviously be just to use color, but another one might be to use something like alignment. So you could do something like that. When I hover over the button lifts up. It's very obvious that's the button that's being hovered over. So use alignment or non-alignment to emphasize things. So that's visual hierarchy principle number 3. Principle number 4, objects that are grouped together seem related. So we have here a basic card element that I whipped up. And I think it's very clear, because these are all grouped together in this card, that if I were to click this see more button, I would be learning more about whatever the content of this card is. So that's visual hierarchy principle number 4. Things that are grouped together, things that are in close proximity to each other, seem related. Cool. So here are some sort of, I guess, little inspirational components, things that you could use, things that I just whipped up, sorry, that sort of exemplify some of these principles. So I've got a couple of cards here. So with this card here on the left, this one here, right, we have elements that are grouped together. So we know that everything in this card refers to the same thing, basically, because they're all grouped together. The header text is bigger and bolder and in a different color to the body text, so we can clearly identify it as being different. And we've used contrast and perspective. I guess we've added a little shadow when you hover over that card to connote, to emphasize it, basically. Here's another example, same card, I just changed the colors a little bit. I'll give you some advice about where I go to get colors anyway, if I'm struggling to find a good color theme a bit later. But yeah, similar vibe, Again, the header text is a very different color to the background and the other text, so it always pops out. And yeah, and this is a case of us using color and contrasting color to highlight when an element is being focused on. Also, colors generally connote meaning. So for example, success buttons tend to be green and danger buttons tend to be red, and other buttons tend to be some other color like this purple. Or there's another example of another button, yeah. So this button was actually inspired by the buttons on the Airbnb website, I want to say. Let's see. I don't have an Airbnb account, so I'm not leaking any crucial information here. But yeah, it was inspired by this button, though I sort of put my own spin on it. But basically, this button has some gradients in the text colors as well, which I think is kind of nice. It's a subtle little thing that helps that text pop a little bit. The text is not just one color; it goes from this sort of deep purple here to this almost pinkish color at the other end. So if I come back here, you can see that this, when in its unhovered state, starts from deep purple, then sort of the text follows the same sort of gradient as you go up, and then that when you hover over it, now the button becomes white and the background of the button text becomes white and the background of the button takes on a similar sort of gradient. So yeah, that's some food for thought there. And if we want to see an example of this in action, we can look at the YouTube homepage. So based on everything that we've just seen, can anyone point out to me some of those design principles that are at work here in the YouTube homepage? Anybody? Take a guess. Doesn't have to be right. Important things are bigger. Video? Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Yes. So the most important thing is the thumbnail, right? Because images tend to grab the eye. And so yes, the thumbnail is the most prominent part of each button card. And something else you'll notice about the button cards is that obviously these are all kind of grouped together, and not only is the video better, is the video bigger, but the video title is bolded compared to the other stuff, which is sort of either regular or light text, font weight wise. So that obviously promotes the importance of the title. And so that's something that we saw, even if I sort of go back to the headers and the cards that I made here, the title was bolder than the rest of the text. So that's something you'll see quite frequently. What else can people see in terms of color? To give you some direction, what can people see? What's going on with color on this page?
The sign-in buttons are blue, which is like the only blue thing on the page.
Yeah, exactly. The sign-in buttons are blue. Good. So it draws attention to it. It makes it prominent. You know, that's good. Yeah, you'll see lots of that sort of stuff. You know, there's also this big banner which is showing up here, advertising. Does anyone actually use YouTube Music out of curiosity? I've never used it. I've never met anyone who uses it either, but it seems to still be going on. So anyway, but yes, so they have this big banner for YouTube Music here. Notice also the lots of negative space. So by negative space, I mean it's all kind of, it's largely empty space apart from this stuff on the left-hand side. And so what that does is, well, I don't actually think that works in their favor. I think if you really wanted to promote YouTube Music properly, you would make this text bigger. You would probably make it more dominant, more obviously noticeable. Because when I look at this page, I sort of just glaze over the banner. I didn't even notice it was there at first. But yeah, so that's my opinion anyway. But it is there, and it is like, it does take up a whole row, so it is sort of visually bigger, I guess. And it uses contrasting colors of the black and then the white and the red to emphasize the text in the button and make sure that's all visible. Also notice that these whites are more brighter and more noticeable than the gray of the little X button on the top right hand corner, so that you're less likely to notice the X button compared to the whites. It's a little bit of sneaky stuff going on there. But yeah, so that's that, I would say. There's lots of other little things happening here as well. So obviously they've kept to a consistent font scheme, so they aren't using a bunch of wildly varying fonts across the page. The fonts all look basically very similar, and they're just variants on the same basic ideas. They haven't gone crazy with colors. They've kept it to a fairly minimalistic color palette of black, white, red, and then, as Sarah said, the occasional blue. Which it helps not overload the user. So if you look at a website that has like 5 billion different colors, you find that it's actually quite hard to read. It's quite hard to focus on any one thing because there are so many different things all vying for your attention. And it's very hard to actually stay on those websites for a long period of time. So there's a lot of wisdom in not going crazy with colors as well, and just picking a color palette or a color scheme and sticking with it for the entirety of your application so that you have consistency, basically. So with that in mind, let's have some fun and let's build something together. So did I really not? Oh, I didn't link this up. That's a bit sad. Okay, let me quickly fix that. Cool. Okay, here we go. So this is very similar, what I just whipped up here. This is very similar to something that I made in like early 2020, I think, or early 20s. I think it was early 2020. Yeah. So a couple of years ago now. So let's first tear it to shreds because it's kind of terrible. And then let's fix it and make it better. So who wants to roast my work? Go for it. Tell me why this is bad. Because there's a lot of stuff wrong with it.
Maybe the submission date could be like in a less heavy font and like smaller because it doesn't seem super important.
Yeah, exactly, right? So by making the submitted timestamp as big as the lab header font, I've basically said they're of equal importance. But really, like, does anyone really care about submission time that much? No. So yes, very good. That will be definitely one thing to do. What else is wrong? There are some other things too. Also, obviously, disclaimer that like all of this is subjective, but there are these general principles that have been found to, broadly speaking, work for most people. So when I'm saying that some stuff is wrong, I'm being flippant. There's not really right or wrong, but there are some things, there are some traditions and standards for UI design that this definitely breaks. Might be preference, but for the padding for the view and is so big, the font size is a bit microscopic. Yeah, that's a valid point. It's not, I think, the most immediate thing that I would think of, but yeah, definitely a valid point. Thank you, William. Anyone else? Anyone else have any ideas?
Maybe like in the top nav bar, the grades color is very similar to like the inactive forums and lecture slides colors. So like maybe if someone's colorblind, they can't really tell what their active tab is.
Yeah, so like, yeah, it is like it is blue and there's a gray, but yeah, you're right. Like it could, that difference could definitely be pronounced a bit more so that it's obvious. Yep, very good. All right, let's make a start with that. That's given us a lot of good things to start with. Let's go from there. Okay, let's work on this. Let's work on. Also, this is Figma. For anyone who hasn't used Figma before, it's a really nifty tool to just do some really quick UI, like user interface prototyping work. Because otherwise you have to like code it all out and then you have to sort of, it can be easier to just draw it and then figure out what you want before you jump into code. And that's what Figma enables you to do. So Figma is a prototyping tool or a wireframing tool. And it's really, really useful, and it is free to an extent for students. So I would definitely recommend checking it out. Cool. Okay, so let's make these colors a little more pronounced, as Sarah was saying. So what do we think? Something a bit, it's a bit of a, it's a this one's a bit of a line to walk because you don't want to make it too white because then it will be hard to distinguish from the background. So you could do something like that, or as another approach, you could instead, I'll put that back to, it was like kind of, what was it? It was something like that. You could also make it more obvious with like a more visible line. So make the stroke like, okay, we could do something like that to make it a bit more visible. There are options, I'm just sort of kind of winging this as I go, but I think we would all agree that that is a bit more obvious than what we had before. So it's a good point there. Let's make this text a bit smaller. We could probably make it regular. That looks better already. And I would say we could probably do that. Yeah, that's looking much better already. Let's just work on one of these cards because all of these are the same. Cool. Now I know, Will, you had your point with the buttons, so the font size is a bit microscopic. Let's see, something. So let me actually, let's scrap these buttons. We'll come back to them later. Is there anything up with this mark? Can anyone think of something like, doesn't this just look a little weird? Or is that just me?
It looks weird, but I have no suggestions, so.
So we agree that it looks weird, but does anyone have any idea why it looks weird? What's wrong with it? Any ideas? Let me throw something out there. Would this look less weird? Does that look any less weird? Anyone? Thumbs up from Sarah. Very cool. Looks better. Yeah. All right. Cool. Why do we think that looks better? Any ideas?
White space and alignment, maybe.
Yeah, white space and alignment. So if we look to where it was earlier, this is, I mean, technically it's center aligned, like on the vertical center, but it doesn't really line up with either of these two because neither of these are vertically centered. And yeah, I think William, well, you sort of nailed it. There's a lot of negative space and very little information, and the negative space wasn't really being that useful. And remember, we talked about earlier, things being grouped together means they're related. And so obviously everything was still grouped in the box, but there's all this negative space and it's weird. And then your eyes have to go basically like 2/3 of the way across the screen to get to the information. And it's just, why? Like there's no good reason for it. So 2020 me had no idea what he was doing. And so it's much cleaner to do something like this. We have everything horizontally aligned. Yeah, everything's on the same x-axis point, basically. And there's not that weird amount of negative space that's taking up everything, right? So I think this is already looking a lot better, but we have 7 minutes to go. So let's make this look even spiffier. First of all, I think we're rapidly getting to the point in this page where we don't need these many colors, not really. And these colors, like they're not really taking on any meaning. So, okay, we have red at the top for selections, sure, okay. But then this mark color is kind of, it's blue and it's not really immediately clear why. So I think in this case, it might be cleaner if we just stick with that sort of black color that we had earlier. And now we had those two buttons from before. Let's let's make those buttons a bit more interesting. So and remember, like, there's not really an exact science to this, I would say. I'm sort of winging this on the fly. So I'm not guaranteeing that everything that I do will make things look better. I'm just experimenting with stuff and playing around. And that's what you have to do when you're doing design. You don't know if the changes you're gonna make are gonna be better, but you have to try it, and then maybe you'll end up with something different at the end of the day. So cool. We have two buttons, or two boxes. We'll make them buttons in a sec. I think one was, call it view. Will sort of, yeah. Cool. I don't know, we'll call this one submit. Cool. Okay. So first off, I think it's nice to, buttons that have different functions should seem different to each other. It's like, at the moment, there's nothing apart from the text that distinguishes these two buttons from each other. So we could do something like this. We could, for example, if we make that text white, oops, make that text white, and then if we make this button kind of black, and then we do the opposite here. But we'll give it a stroke. Now those buttons look clearly distinguishable, right? So would we say that that looks better than having them look the same? Any thoughts? Okay, heart react, love to see it, thank you. So making those buttons visually distinguishable from each other, I think has been nice. I think, like personally, I think this black stroke is a little aggressive, so I might tone it down just a smidge. Actually, maybe I just want to make it a bit thinner. Can I do like 0.2? Oh, that's a bit too thin. 0.5? Yeah, maybe that looks a little better. I don't know, I'm just fiddling around with it. Like at some level, your own aesthetic preferences will come into play and you'll be like, oh, I think this looks better, or I think that looks better, you know. We could try fiddling around with, let me, hang on, before we do that, let me just group these so that we don't end up moving the button and not the text. We could try playing around with the placement of these. So, oh, I didn't group these properly. So we could try, for example, doing something like this. Do we think that looks better? It might. I don't know whether there's necessarily a huge difference between the two, but maybe your aesthetic preferences will tell you, oh, they look better vertical. You know, I don't know. But as you can see, I think this is already looking a lot better. So let me group this. Let's make some more. Okay, cool. I think it's just gonna tell me when they're, no, it's gonna be annoying. Hang on, sorry. Figma is a little bit annoying when it comes to alignment sometimes. Trying to roughly center align it. And I'm terrible at it. Like, if you ask my partner, she'll tell you that I have zero alignment sense. I think things are aligned and then they're just not. So yeah. But yes, cool. So there, I think we can all agree that that looks better. It's an improvement at least. And so then to recap, hold Alt key and hover your mouse. Oh, cool. There you go. Thank you, Darian. I didn't know that. Learned something new. Yeah, I am by no means a Figma pro. I just use the platform casually and I know enough to get the job done. Hold the Alt key and hover your mouse. Ah, cool. Okay, see, so it's not aligned. See, I was right, or rather my girlfriend was right. I'm an idiot. Yes. Okay, cool. So, yeah, it needs to be bumped along a little bit. 250. Okay, so we need to do something like that. Okay, cool. So that's technically much closer to being vertically centered. There you go. So, to recap, basic principles of UI design. Group things together if you want them to be perceived as referring to the same thing. Use contrasting colors, use size. Like I think, for example, we could probably afford to make Mark maybe you could make it like regular or something. You could play it or like make it a little bit smaller. Like maybe I don't know, something to fiddle around with. So use size, use contrasting colors, group things together. Use white space if you can use white space really effectively, in the sense that you can like you can use it like if there's a lot of space around something, your eye tends to get drawn to that thing that has a lot of space around it. But it can also be very much a double-edged sword. So as you saw earlier with that marks thing, like it was sort of just, it looked odd because there was too much white space there. So be aware of that as well. The other thing I want to touch on, because it is important, is basically the idea of what's called pattern affordance. Basically, users want things that they recognize, right? That's why like people have their menus in the top right hand corner, because that's where we're used to going to look for a menu. That's why if we go to YouTube, that's why they have this hamburger menu, as it's called, in the top right hand corner of the page. It's pattern affordance. So um, we're used to seeing those kinds of things, and so it's good to be able to implement those as well. Because users, there's a UI design principle called recognition over recall. Recognition over recall. So basically, the idea being that you recognize something, you don't have to like learn it, if that makes sense. It's the same system that you're used to using. So that's why we see patterns like, oh, this is tabs, like you know immediately what this is. You know, so it's worth being aware of that sort of stuff too. The README solutions for the where is it? The UI critique websites, they go into a bit more detail about this. So yeah, we talked a lot about visual hierarchy today. Affordance is what we talked about as well. So yeah, using things like the home button icon, right? Like we sort of know what that will do. Using familiar icons like the user icon. So you see in the sign in, like we all know that that's the user icon. We probably didn't even need to read the text. We could have just seen the icon. We know exactly what the purpose of that button is. So lots of stuff like that. I would encourage you to really try and implement this stuff in your assignment 3. As far as pattern affordance and visual hierarchy and that sort of thing, because I think it's really cool that it exists and that it's something that we know about, and that there are all these little things that you can do to just make your sites that much better. Cool. All right, I think that is what we have time for today.